If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The marble hall of the Curia Hostilia was built for grandeur, not mercy. Morning light entered through narrow openings in the ceiling, cutting pale beams across the stone floor where Cassian stood in chains. The sound of sandals scraping, armor shifting, and whispers echoing off the high walls made the air heavy. Every sound felt amplified, as if the city itself were listening. Cassian Vero had been a centurion once, a soldier known for discipline and restraint. He had served 12 years on the northern frontier, earned his scar near Aquileia, and returned to Rome with more scars than ambition. When the Senate began hoarding grain during a drought, Cassian had spoken against the governor's decree that favored profit over people. He wasn't a politician. He was a soldier who had seen men die for less injustice. But in Rome, speaking the truth against the powerful was a sentence in itself. At the center dais sat Governor Lucius Faustus, wrapped in purple-trimmed robes, his face calm, but his eyes sharp and watchful. Next to him, on a smaller seat, was his daughter, Livia Fausta. She was no longer a child, but not yet hardened like the men around her. Her presence at the tribunal was ceremonial, a symbol of family authority. Yet beneath her composure, her hands trembled faintly in her lap. She had begged her father not to preside over the hearing himself, but Lucius believed in controlling every outcome. Cassian's voice was steady when he spoke. I distributed the grain because the soldiers' families were starving. The order to withhold it came from men who never missed a meal. His tone wasn't defiant. It was tired, sincere, and direct. Lucius leaned forward. You defied a lawful command. You interfered in state affairs. I obeyed conscience, Cassian replied, his wrists bleeding slightly from the tight bronze cuffs. If Rome cannot feed her own, then her laws are worth less than the dust on her roads. The hall murmured. A senator shifted uncomfortably. Livia looked up briefly, just long enough to see that Cassian wasn't afraid. His expression was calm, not reckless, and that calmness unsettled her more than any plea for mercy could have. Lucius raised his hand, silencing the crowd. You stand accused of insubordination, theft, and undermining the authority of the Republic. The court finds you guilty. The words came so quickly that Livia barely realized judgment had been passed. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to say that Cassian had once saved her brother's life on the frontier, that he had earned honor through service. But her father's voice was iron, and she remained silent. Cassian's sentence was pronounced with the cold rhythm of a practiced man. Death in the arena. The guards turned him toward the exit. Chains rattled. The crowd began to move again, talking as if the condemned were already gone. Cassian glanced once more toward the dais. His gaze passed over Lucius without pause, then stopped on Livia. There was no hatred in it, only quiet disbelief, as if he still expected someone to stop this. Livia's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the final orders. She felt the sting of shame before the echo of her father's voice faded. She kept her head down, but her eyes burned. She didn't move, didn't breathe, until Cassian had disappeared beyond the marble doors. When the hall emptied, Lucius turned to her. You understand why this had to be done, he said. Yes, father, she answered automatically, though her voice shook. That night, Rome glowed red under torchlight. The streets filled with laughter from taverns and the smell of oil lamps and wine. Inside the governor's villa, everything was quiet. Livia sat alone near the window, staring at the city walls beyond which the condemned were kept. She told herself she had done nothing wrong, that silence was obedience, and obedience was safety. But the truth settled heavy in her chest. She had watched a man be condemned because she was too afraid to speak. Cassian slept that night in a dark cell beneath the amphitheater, the iron taste of rust in his mouth. He thought not of revenge, but of survival, of the day he had once stood beneath the same sun wearing armor, not chains. He didn't know that above him, in a quiet villa, the governor's daughter was awake too, unable to escape the sound of his calm voice echoing in her mind. And so the trial ended, not with shouts or blood, but with two people, one condemned, one complicit, both trapped in the silence they had chosen. The amphitheater roared like a living creature. It was the kind of noise that made men feel invincible and condemned alike. Cashin stood beneath the gate, half blinded by the sunlight spilling through the iron bars. The guard unlocked his shackles, his voice rough and disinterested. "Walk when the horn sounds. Don't stop. Don't look back." Cashin nodded once. His body was leaner than it had been as a soldier. Months in the holding cells had burned away everything unnecessary. He had no armor of his own, only the worn pieces given to condemned fighters, cracked leather, dull iron, and a sword that bent if struck too hard. But the balance of the blade was familiar. His hands still remembered the weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing again the words of the trial, death in the arena. He thought of Livia's silence, of her eyes looking down while his fate was sealed. He had not hated her for it. He understood fear too well. But understanding did not erase the image. The horn sounded. Cashin stepped into the sunlight. The sand was hot beneath his feet, the crowd's roar swelling as the gate closed behind him. Across the arena stood two other men, trained gladiators, not prisoners. One wore a curved blade, the other a trident and net. Both eyed him like hunters gauging the worth of their prey. When the signal was given, the first man attacked fast. Cashin moved instinctively, stepping aside and countering low. The crowd shouted. He felt the blade cut across his shoulder, but ignored the sting. The fight was close, brutal, and clumsy, not the dance of trained killers, but the desperate survival of men who had nothing left to lose. When Cashin drove his sword into the first man's thigh, the arena erupted. The second opponent hesitated, seeing something in Cashin's calm that unsettled him. Cashin waited. He did not taunt. He did not smile. When the trident came forward, he caught it under his arm, pulled, and struck once cleanly. The man fell, blood spreading across the sand. Cashin stood motionless, his breath steady, his expression unreadable. The crowd began to chant his name. It spread slowly at first, Cashin, 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 until even the guards at the gates joined in. From the governor's balcony above, Livia watched, frozen. She had not expected to see him again. The reports had said the condemned rarely lasted a day. Yet there he stood, alive, his face marked but his spirit unbroken. Her father leaned forward. "The man has endurance," Lucius said quietly, half admiring, half cautious. "Perhaps fortune has chosen him for a different use." Livia said nothing. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Cashin's expression, the stillness of it. There was no triumph, no rage, no plea for mercy. Only silence, like a man who had already lost everything worth losing. That night, after the games ended, Cashin was taken back to the holding cells, bleeding but alive. He sat in the dark, back against the wall, the cheers of the crowd still echoing faintly above him. He didn't think of glory or revenge. He thought of survival. Each breath was proof that the judgment hall hadn't ended him. In the weeks that followed, the city began to whisper his name. They called him the silent centurion, the soldier who refused to die. Some said the gods favored him. Others said the Senate would soon claim him as a political symbol. Cashin cared little for either. He fought when ordered, ate when food was given, and slept when exhaustion forced him to. He was no hero. He was a man trying to stay alive long enough to see the sky without chains. Meanwhile, in the governor's villa, Livia tried to quiet her thoughts, but news of his victories reached her daily. Her servants spoke his name without knowing she was listening. At night, she dreamed of the look on his face when the verdict was read, the disbelief, the quiet acceptance. It haunted her because she knew it mirrored her own expression when she chose silence over truth. Weeks later, after Cashin's fifth victory, a decree was announced. Any gladiator who survived 10 matches without defeat would be granted freedom. The crowd celebrated, hungry for more blood, but for Livia, it was something else, a faint, impossible hope. She stood again at her balcony, watching the torches flicker across the forum. Somewhere in the city's depths, The man she had condemned was still fighting, still alive, and though she would never admit it aloud, she prayed he would survive, not for redemption, not even for forgiveness, but so that she might one day face him and say the words she had not been brave enough to speak in that marble hall. In Rome, life was cheap, survival was rare, but the story of Cassian Varro was beginning to spread, and even in the cold chambers of power, people were beginning to ask one question the governor could not silence. What happens when a condemned refuses to die? Months passed, and Cassian became a name whispered in the corridors of Rome. The city that once demanded his death now demanded his return to the arena. People argued whether he was man or myth, soldier or ghost. The Senate used his victories to distract from famine and scandal, while the governor, Livia's father, used them to prove that Rome's justice was divine, that even condemned men could find honor through blood. But behind the applause and torches, Cassian lived as a tool, not a victor. He slept in a narrow cell beneath the Colosseum, where the walls dripped with moisture and the smell of iron never faded. When not fighting, he was sent to repair the armor and weapons of other gladiators. His soldiers' discipline now reduced to hammering dents from the helmets of men who would soon die. He was allowed no contact with the outside world, yet rumors still reached him. Whispers that the governor had used his name to secure favor with the Senate, that his supposed mercy, allowing Cassian to fight rather than be executed, had elevated him among Rome's political elite. Cassian felt nothing at first, but over time, that same silence that had once protected him began to weigh like armor too heavy to remove. When he was alone, he thought of Livia. The memory of her silence in the judgment hall had haunted him through every strike and scar. Not because he hated her, but because he didn't understand her. In her eyes, he had seen fear, pity, and something else he couldn't name. He tried to forget her, but the more he fought to survive, the more he felt chained to that moment when their fates split in two. By his 10th victory, Cassian was offered freedom. The ceremony was brief. A herald read a decree from the Senate, the crowd cheered, and a laurel wreath was placed on his head. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. When the guards opened the gates, he walked through them as if walking into another kind of prison. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he breathed air that wasn't filled with blood and dust. He walked through the forum, barefoot, scarred, still wearing the battered armor that had once been his death sentence. People stepped aside, watching him with reverence and fear. The same citizens who had once demanded his execution now whispered blessings as he passed. Above the square, on the balcony of her father's villa, Livia saw him. Her breath caught. The crowd parted around Cassian as if the city itself were bowing. Her father watched as well, his expression unreadable. "You see," Lucius said quietly, "Rome forgives through spectacle. That man's survival is my gift to the people." Livia didn't answer. She knew what he meant. Cassian's life had been turned into proof of the governor's power. A living advertisement for the mercy of a system that had none. But when she looked at Cassian's face, she didn't see mercy or victory. She saw exhaustion. A man who had outlived every reason to hate, every reason to hope. That night, unable to sleep, Livia went to the balcony again. She could still hear the distant echoes of the crowd celebrating his freedom. For the first time since the trial, she allowed herself to think beyond her fear. She remembered how Cassian had once served under her brother during the northern campaigns, how he had written letters home praising Cassian's discipline and integrity. Her brother had died on the frontier, and Cassian had escorted his body back to Rome himself. That was how he had met her family. That was why her father had trusted him. Now, years later, her father had condemned that same man. She realized with sudden clarity that the judgment hall had not been about justice or grain. It had been about control. Cassian had spoken against her father's prophets, and for that, he had been marked as a traitor. Somewhere across the city, Cassian sat alone in a small workshop near the southern gate, repairing a broken gladius. The forge's glow painted his face in shades of bronze and shadow. He could have left Rome, but he didn't. He stayed because he had nowhere else to go, because he wanted to live without hiding. When the door creaked open, he didn't look up. A figure in a pale cloak stepped inside. The scent of myrrh and fine oil carried faintly through the air, an unmistakable sign of wealth. Livia pulled back her hood. "You don't remember me," she said softly. Cashin set the hammer down and finally looked at her. "I remember," he replied after a pause. His voice was quiet but steady. She hesitated. "I came to speak what I should have said years ago." He studied her face, older now, paler, but still burdened by the same guilt he remembered. "Then speak," he said, but no words came. Only silence stretched between them, thick and fragile. After a moment, she placed a small loaf of bread on the workbench and turned to leave. Cashin didn't stop her. When she was gone, he sat there for a long time, staring at the bread. The next morning, when he arrived to open the forge, the bread was gone, because he had eaten it. He didn't know why. And from that moment on, Livia began to return, each time with something small, each time saying less. And each time, Cashin realized that what had begun in betrayal was slowly becoming something else entirely. Something without a name yet, but something that made him wait for the sound of the door to open again. Days became weeks, and Livia's visits continued. She never announced herself, never stayed long, and never brought the same thing twice. Some days she left bread or olives. Other days a cloth for cleaning tools or a small flask of oil. Each time, Cashin accepted them without a word, and each time she found some unspoken reason to return. The forge, once filled with the harsh rhythm of iron and fire, had grown quieter during her visits, as if both were careful not to disturb the fragile stillness between them. Cashin did not know what to make of her persistence. At first, he believed it was guilt, a noble woman's attempt to feel righteous again after condemning an innocent man. But her silence didn't match guilt. It was something else. There was a restraint to her gestures, a kind of peace she was searching for and couldn't find anywhere else. When she entered the forge, her shoulders would relax slightly, as though she had escaped the world above. One afternoon, as the sun fell over the rooftops, she lingered longer than usual. Cashin was sharpening a blade, the sound of the whetstone steady and deliberate. She watched his hands, calm, precise, unhurried, and asked quietly, "Do you ever think of leaving Rome?" He didn't look up. "No place to go. You could have left after your freedom was granted," she said. "I fought to live," Cashin replied, his voice even. "Not to run." The words carried no pride, no bitterness, just fact. Livia looked at him for a long time, studying the man who had survived the arena not through strength, but through endurance. There was something unsettling about his calm, as if all the rage and grief inside him had been buried so deep it could no longer be reached. "Your father still rules," Cashin said suddenly, breaking the silence. Livia's expression tightened. "You think I don't know?" "I think you don't speak of it," he answered. She hesitated. Then, for the first time, she spoke the truth she had buried for years. "My father sent you to die because you embarrassed him. The grain you distributed came from the Senate stockpiles. He was selling it to the provinces at twice the price." Cashin stopped working. The weight of her words hung in the air. He had suspected corruption, but hearing it from her changed something. Not the past, but the meaning of it. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Because I couldn't say it then," she said. "And because I'm tired of being afraid." Cashin looked at her. The faint flicker of the forge reflected in her eyes, but her expression was steady. For the first time since the trial, he saw not the governor's daughter, but a woman standing alone against the shadow of her own name. That night, after she left, Cashin sat by the dying embers and thought about what she had said. He remembered the soldiers who had suffered for doing what was right, the families who had starved while officials dined in luxury. Her confession didn't absolve him of anger, but it changed its shape. It no longer burned. It simply existed, dull and heavy, like an old scar that no longer hurt but never fully faded. Over the next weeks, her visits became more deliberate. She began helping him in small ways, wiping soot from the table, sorting metal scraps, fetching water. Cashin tried to refuse, but she ignored him. He noticed how her hands, once soft and unused to work, began to roughen slightly from the tools. The people of the district started to notice too. Whispers spread quickly that the governor's daughter was visiting the former gladiator, that they spoke little but were often seen together. Some said she was shamed. Others said she was bewitched. Neither cared. They simply continued, unbothered by gossip, each day shaped by the quiet repetition of work and shared silence. But beyond the city walls, unrest was growing. The Senate was split, the provinces restless, and rumors of conspiracy reached even the lower quarters. One evening, a messenger from the palace arrived at the forge. Cassian recognized the crest on his cloak, the governor's seal. The man handed him a scroll and left without a word. The message was short. Cassian Vero is ordered to report to the governor's estate by sunrise. Matters of state. Livia arrived not long after. Cassian handed her the scroll silently. She read it, her expression tightening as she reached the end. "He knows I've been coming here," she said under her breath. "He'll use this against you." "I'm not afraid of him," Cassian said. "You should be," she replied, her voice sharper now. "He has no reason to forgive. To him, you're a reminder of his weakness." Cassian folded the scroll and placed it on the table. "Then I'll face him. I've lived long enough hiding from his shadow." Livia stepped closer. "If you go there alone, he'll destroy you." He met her eyes. "And if I don't, he'll keep destroying others." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was tense, but not hostile, more like the silence before a storm. Finally, Livia whispered, "Then I'm going with you." Cassian shook his head. "No, you've done enough." She straightened her shoulders. "This time, I won't stay silent." The next morning, as dawn crept over Rome's rooftops, Cassian walked through the streets toward the governor's villa. Beside him, wrapped in a plain cloak, Livia kept pace, her jaw set, her eyes fixed ahead. For the first time since the day of the trial, they were walking toward the same judgment, not as accuser and condemned, but as two people who had finally chosen to face what Rome had made of them. The city was waking, unaware that before the sun reached its height, one of its most powerful men would be confronted not by enemies, but by the two souls he had broken to preserve his name. The governor's villa stood high above the forum, its marble steps gleaming in the early light. The guards at the gate shifted uneasily when they saw Cassian approach. They recognized him at once. The freed gladiator whose name had filled the city's arenas, the man who was supposed to be dead years ago. Behind him, Livia walked with her hood drawn, her stride calm but determined. The soldiers hesitated, waiting for orders that hadn't come. Cassian spoke first. "I was summoned," he said. His tone was firm but measured, like a man who no longer feared what awaited him. They stepped aside. No one dared question the daughter of Lucius Faustus when she entered her own home, even in the company of a man who had once stood condemned by her father. Inside, the villa was exactly as Cassian remembered from the day of his trial. Polished marble floors, gilded statues, walls painted with the victories of Rome. Yet now those same walls seemed colder, more hollow, as if decorated to disguise decay. Servants watched from the shadows as Livia led Cassian through the long corridor toward the atrium. Lucius Faustus was waiting. He sat behind a low table, surrounded by documents and sealed letters. He had aged, his hair thinner, his face sharper, but the authority in his eyes was the same. When he saw Cassian, his lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "So the dead man returns," Lucius said quietly, "and brings my daughter as escort. Tell me, Cassian, what is it you hope to gain by walking into the lion's den?" "I was ordered to come," Cassian replied. Lucius's gaze flicked toward Livia. "And you, daughter? You defy my command again by standing with him?" She removed her hood, meeting her father's stare without flinching. "You summoned him. I came because I knew what you intend." Lucius rose slowly. "What I intend," he said, "is to protect this house from the stench of rebellion. The Senate watches me. Every whisper about you, and this man stains my name. You think I will allow that to continue?" Livia took a breath, steady and clear. "You already allowed worse, father. You condemned an innocent soldier to die so the Senate would not see your theft." The word struck like iron. Cassian said nothing, watching the exchange in silence. Lucius's composure faltered for the first time. You dare accuse your own blood? I dare speak what Rome already knows, she said. You sold grain meant for the legions and blamed him for your crime. You built your reputation on lies, and now you're afraid the truth will ruin you. Lucius's voice dropped, hard and cold. Enough. But Livia didn't stop. You taught me to obey, to remain silent. I did, and an innocent man bled for it. I will not remain silent again. Cassian stepped forward then, his voice calm but cutting through the tension. Governor, you wanted this meeting for one reason, to ensure I stay quiet. Lucius's eyes narrowed. You are a freedman, nothing more. Your life exists by my permission. Not anymore, Cassian replied. I've already died once. You can't take what's already gone. The governor's hand trembled slightly, the first visible crack in his armor of authority. You think the people will believe a disgraced soldier and a foolish girl? They already do, Cassian said. They cheer the man you condemned. They whisper her name with mine, and they will not forget. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Outside, the faint sound of the city began to rise. The morning calls of merchants, the distant clatter of wheels over stone. Lucius turned away, staring out the window toward the forum where statues of old heroes stood in the sun. His voice, when it came, was quieter. You could both be gone by tomorrow, he said. Disappeared. Forgotten. Rome buries its stories easily. Livia stepped closer. Then bury us together, she said, because I won't run, and neither will he. Lucius turned back slowly, studying them both. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't before. His power meant nothing to people who no longer feared him. His hand lowered. His face, once stern and immovable, now looked weary. You've both made your choice, he said finally. Then live with the consequences. He walked away, leaving them standing in the silence of the great hall. When the heavy doors closed behind him, Livia exhaled. The trembling in her hands began only after her father was gone. Cassian looked at her, his expression unreadable. You spoke what I never could, he said quietly. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled faintly. You survived what I couldn't. For a long time, they stood there without words. The air between them felt changed, no longer burdened by guilt, no longer defined by the past. By evening, the news began to spread through the lower districts. The governor's daughter had publicly defied her father, and a man once condemned to die had walked out of the villa alive. People whispered that Lucius Faustus had been recalled to the Senate to answer for his dealings. Others said he would be exiled before the week's end. In the small forge by the southern gate, Cassian worked through the night. Livia sat nearby, silent, watching the glow of the fire reflect on his face. Rome was restless, uncertain, but for the first time in years, neither of them were. When dawn came, the sound of hammers echoed once more. Not for war, not for blood, but for rebuilding. Livia placed her hand lightly on the edge of the work table. Cassian looked up. Their eyes met, not with passion, but with quiet recognition. Two people who had faced the worst of Rome and walked away still human. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The forge burned steadily, the first light of morning pouring in through the open door. And for the first time, Cassian felt that survival no longer meant merely staying alive. It meant beginning again. The days after the confrontation passed in uneasy quiet. Rome was never still. Merchants shouted, soldiers marched, priests chanted, but beneath the noise, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Rumors spread that Governor Lucius Faustus had been stripped of his command. Some said he had fled to the coast before his arrest, others that he was summoned to stand trial before the Senate. What mattered most was that his power was gone. For Livia, it was not triumph but release. She no longer lived under her father's shadow, but the cost of that freedom was silence from the world she once belonged to. The noble families who had filled her father's hall no longer greeted her in the streets. Invitations ceased, servants whispered when she passed. She had traded comfort for conscience. Cassian, meanwhile, rebuilt his life the only way he knew, through work. The forge by the southern gate became his home and his rhythm. He repaired swords for the city guard, tools for farmers, and nails for builders. His reputation spread quietly, not as a gladiator, but as a craftsman whose word was solid and whose hands were steady. He never spoke of the arena, or of the governor, or of what had been taken from him. He lived as if the past had no power left to wound him. Livia began helping him openly now. No disguises, no secrecy. She swept the floor, brought water, kept the accounts. At first, the workers from neighboring stalls watched her with suspicion. A noble woman doing menial work was a sight no one understood. But over time, they accepted her. They saw how she carried herself, neither proud nor ashamed, and how Cashin treated her with quiet respect, not indulgence. Sometimes, when the forge was empty, she would ask him questions that had long remained unspoken. "Did you ever hate me?" she asked one evening as they worked side by side, the light from the furnace painting their faces gold and red. Cashin paused, the hammer still in his hand. "No," he said after a moment. "Hate doesn't last that long. It burns itself out. What took its place?" He met her gaze, understanding. She nodded, though her throat tightened. "And forgiveness?" He looked down at the metal cooling on the anvil. "That came when I stopped needing it." There was no bitterness in his voice, only calm. Livia understood then that what tied them together was not apology or romance, but something simpler. Two lives reshaped by the same wound, learning to exist without reopening it. As weeks turned to months, their quiet routine became something deeper. They shared meals at the same table, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in comfortable silence. She laughed more often now, softly, without fear of who might hear. Cashin, though rarely smiling, began to speak more freely, telling fragments of his time as a soldier, his memories of the northern campaigns, the frost and fire of distant battlefields. The forge became more than a workshop. It became a refuge. People came not just to repair their weapons, but to rest, to talk, to ask advice. Cashin had become what he was always meant to be, a man others trusted. One afternoon, as spring light filled the courtyard, a messenger arrived with a scroll sealed in red wax. It was addressed to Cashin Vero and Livia Fausta. Cashin broke it open and read silently. It was a formal decree. The Senate recognizes the dismissal of Lucius Faustus and grants the return of his confiscated properties to his surviving kin. The daughter, Livia Fausta, may retain citizenship and inheritance free of debt or accusation. She stared at the document for a long time before speaking. "It's over," she said softly. Cashin nodded. "Then you're free." Livia looked at him. "We both are." That evening, they closed the forge early. Cashin carried the tools outside, setting them on a bench to cool. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. Livia sat on the steps, her hands folded in her lap. For a while, neither spoke. The air was filled only with the faint sounds of the city beyond, the laughter of children, the rustle of olive branches in the wind. Finally, Livia said quietly, "When I saw you walk into the forum that day, I thought it was a ghost. I didn't believe a man could survive what Rome did to you." Cashin's eyes softened. "No one survives Rome," he said. "You just learn to live inside its walls." She smiled faintly. "And now," he said, "we build something that isn't Rome." He looked at her then, truly looked, without the weight of memory or guilt between them. Her hair was loose, touched by the wind, her eyes steady. She reached out, brushing a speck of soot from his arm, a simple, human gesture that needed no words. The forge fire burned low, the last glow reflecting in their eyes. For a moment, they stood there together, surrounded by the quiet hum of evening life, the city breathing, the world still turning. Cashin set down his hammer, and Livia took his hand. It was not an act of passion, but of recognition. Two people who had been broken by power, reshaped by endurance, and had finally found peace not through escape, but through staying. In the distance, a bell rang from the forum, marking the end of the day. Cashin looked toward the horizon, then back at Livia. "Tomorrow," he said simply. "Tomorrow," she repeated, her voice steady, certain. As the night settled over Rome, The light of the forge flickered one last time before dimming to embers. And for the first time in years, both of them slept without fear, knowing the story that began in chains had ended in freedom, not through revenge, but through the quiet strength of two souls who refused to give up on what was human. Their world, small but honest, had finally begun.